We're starting, we've been starting for 2 weeks, right? We're in a series that we've introduced, but today we actually get into the series of the big picture of the Bible. We start the formal reading plan going through Genesis through Revelation today. Genesis 1 to 11 will be your assignment this week, and I'm looking forward to it. I'm looking forward to reading this through together with you. Some of you, if you struggle to read, I would encourage you to get the audio Bible. If you have a phone that can handle the Bible app, I'll put those links up on our Facebook page so that you know where to go. Otherwise, you can gladly ask me which app you need to download in order to get that. What I did in the last couple of weeks is I listened while I read, and it was pretty quick. It went much quicker than I thought it would, reading through. And so I did Genesis 1 to 11. It takes about 40 minutes if you read together with listening to it. That's the whole thing. That's not 40 minutes a day. That's 40 minutes this week going through Genesis 1 to 11. So I think it's doable. One thing that I wanted to mention is I forgot to mention the holy language a couple of weeks ago, and I got rebuked for it. High German. If you only understand High German, or if you understand that the best, by all means you can read it in High German too. That works, and I think that God speaks all languages, and through that we can all get God's word. So we start at the beginning. The very beginning. Last time I shared a quote by N.T. Wright that said, "The whole point of Christianity is that it offers a story which is the true story of the whole world." And that's what we find today. This is the true story of the whole world. It is public truth, as he said. And that's the story that we're going to enter into today. And especially at the beginning and the end, you see this. The rest of it brings everybody in. But today we're going to kind of zoom out. And next week we're going to zoom in. Norman's going to zoom in on one particular family line. But today the first 11 verses are actually the foundation history of humanity. And then next week you're going to look at the foundation history of Israel. But our concern today is very broad. It's not very specific. We are actually going through something that spans thousands of years, and in fact, it spans an amount of time that is greater than the amount of time from Genesis 12 till now. And that's amazing. And so we're going to cover a lot of ground today. How did this all come to be? Why are we here? What difference does this make, both at the time of the writing and for us today? Now, most people would say that Moses was the one that wrote the book of Genesis. And he wrote it after the Israelites came out of Egypt. That informs our reading of it. That's very important for us as we read through it. This is some point in the wilderness that Moses is writing this. I think that this is vitally important for us in order to understand what the intent for this book was. So what are the circumstances at the time of writing? Well, the Israelites had been saved from 400 years of slavery in Egypt. Norman will look at that at this time period in a few weeks from now. But they're wandering in the wilderness, likely having already been given the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai. They've messed up a bunch of times. They've struggled with the identity that they should have as God's people. Put yourself in the Israelites' shoes. 400 years have passed. Can you imagine what kinds of ways they compromised on the traditions that were passed down from Abraham? Can you imagine? They've likely lost some of their identity as God's people. Many of us start to resemble the culture in which we live, right? And my guess is that that was no different for the Israelites. I always say that North America is, they're experts at exporting their culture, right? And in Belize today, we are heavily influenced by North American culture. Am I right? Heavily influenced. Just look at Spanish Lookout 10 years ago and look at it today. Changes have come. Clothing that's available. Music. Media. Huge changes in 10 years. Now imagine living in a place for 400 years. You lose a lot of your culture. Perhaps you also lose a lot of your belief system. And so keep that in your mind as we're going through this today. The Israelites are struggling with their identity as the people of God. Who is this God even? What place do we occupy in the story? And I think that has something to do with why Moses writes this book, the purposes of it. So a quick bird's eye view of Genesis 1 to 11. In the beginning, God. He was there in the beginning. He has always been there. God creates what's above and what's below, the heavens and the earth. He brings order to everything, and he creates everything else. Mankind is created. Mankind disobeys and gets kicked out of the garden. Then there's lots of babies, and wickedness takes over. There's a flood that kills everyone except Noah and his family, and then there's more babies, and then finally Tower of Babel and the scattering of humans. It's a good bird's eye view. I can go down now, right? Now we know what happens. That's basically what happens in these first 11 chapters. This morning, though, we actually aren't going to focus on the last part of that. Because the last part of that, it tends to come from the first part. So we're going to focus on the first 4 chapters this morning. We will get into the rest a little bit, but it'll be a summary. So, are we ready to get into it? Okay, Genesis 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. There, we're going to stop right there. There's a lot to chew on there, and we're going to chew on it a little bit. 2 weeks ago, we looked at 4 different things or categories that the Bible uses to tell the story of God and to point us in the right direction. All Scripture centers around Christ. It either predicts Christ, or it prepares for the coming of Christ, or it reflects the nature of God and humanity, or it shares the results of Christ's coming. Today, we mostly see reflection. Today, we mostly see reflection. It reflects God and humanity. This is a reflection of who God is and who humanity is, and then what the rest of creation is. It's like a mirror that's turned toward us, and if you've ever used a mirror, depending on how you tilt it, you can see different things. And so it's like this mirror is pointed at us, and it's first of all pointed up. And you're looking in that mirror, and you're seeing God. And then that mirror turns on us, and we start to see ourselves in light of what we just saw through the mirror that was tilted up. Does that make sense? That's kind of, if you want a picture of what this is, that's kind of what is happening in this passage. What's the picture of God that we see when we read Genesis 1? Well, we see something amazing in these first 2 verses. Moses wants the people to understand that before God took a hold of creation, it was formless and empty. The Hebrew phrase that I found kind of fun to say, and so I'm going to share it. Normally I don't share it because you're thinking, why are we talking Hebrew? We're English speakers. The phrase is tohu vabohu. Everybody say tohu vabohu. Sounds like you guys are all crying. We spoke Hebrew today. Isn't that awesome? The word literally means desolate. It's used in other places as wasteland or wilderness. Basically, it means that it's not able to support life. Things are chaotic. Things aren't making sense. That's how it's used in other places. Gives you a good picture of how this earth was. God created it, but he has yet to order it. This created heavens and earth was not yet set up in such a way that life could happen. And so God begins to order it. And in chapter 1, we see it. He's ordering the chaos. And you know how he does this? He does it by simply speaking. And everything obeys him. It goes exactly where he tells it to. He creates light. He creates the sun, the stars, the moon. God creates it. Now think about it a little bit. These Israelites have been in Egypt, where the Egyptians worshipped all kinds of things. The sun was a god, the god Ra, the most important god. The moon was a god. They fashioned gods that looked like animals. Even their pharaohs were to be worshipped and were God-like people. And if we think about this culture importing that so easily happens, can you imagine what kind of ideas and ideologies these people had begun to think? What they had adopted over 400 years as slaves in Egypt. And so Moses explaining that God brings order to these things, that was the point Moses was making. God brings order to these things. The sun, the moon, the animals, they're just created things by the Almighty Creator. God is above all that. It is God that told that where it needed to go. Moses is a brilliant storyteller, and he uses repeating words and phrases to prove his point. God says something, and then what's the thing that comes up over and over again? God says, and it was so. I love that. God says, and then it was so. Verse 7, God made the vault and separated the water under the vault from the water above it, and it was so. Verse 9, God said, water, dry ground, and it was so. Verse 11, God says plants, and it was so. God says sun, moon, and it was so. Animals, lots of them. God says it, and it was so. Verse 30, man, meet your food, fruits and veggies, and it was so. Animals, your food, that's the plants, and it was so. Interesting, eh? And so he, a brilliant storyteller, and it reinforces this foundational truth that God does as God pleases. Because he's God, and there is only one God over all creation. And you serve that one God, Israelites. You're not serving the sun. You're not serving the moon. You're not trying to appease these created things. You serve God. God brought order to chaos. You know what the picture that I got when I thought about this phrase, God brings order to chaos? I think of school. I was a principal a few years back, and I was always amazed the beginning of the day. Kids are running around. Little Johnny is poking a frog in that corner, and Sally's running away from Billy. I don't know why we use these words, these names, but running away from him. He has some mud in his hand, and he wants to throw it. And our buddy Lester, he's taken a chair and he's moved it right beside the building. And he's almost on the roof, and there's just chaos. Girls are all talking at once. It's chaos. The bell rings, and what happens? They all know they all at least know where they should go. Sometimes they don't always do that, but they run into the classroom and they sit down. 2 minutes from the bell rung, and everything is in order. And I was always amazed when I would come to school. There was kids running and it was screaming, and then I would sit down and ring the bell, and then 2 minutes and it was quiet. Sweet silence. Order. Now, I know that metaphor breaks down because it started quiet. It started formless and empty. There was nothing, but all of a sudden, life broke forth. So maybe it could be they're in their seats in their classroom, and the bell rings, and they all run out, and there's life, right? We could look at it that way too. But imagine, formless and void, quiet, totally quiet. Imagine the sound of wind going through the pine trees the first time. Or maybe the sound of the first whale that surfaced and made a splash. I can't do that sound. Or the first sound of an animal walking, crunching the leaves beneath. Would there have been leaves to crunch? Would leaves have been on the ground, dried out? I don't know. But imagine the first sounds. And then when man breathed his first breath, imagine. God brought life to the world. He ordered the chaos, and out came life. Chapter 2, verse 1 says, "Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array." They were no longer tohu vabohu. No longer chaos, but rather order. No longer formless and empty, but now able to support life. And then what does it say? God declares over creation, and he does it many times. It says, "And God saw that it was good." God saw that it was good. What a declaration over creation. God creates that which is good. And what does he say after he creates mankind and he looks over all creation? God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. Creation is good. God made it that way, and God views it that way. That idea also flew in the face of ancient Egyptian belief. In essence, the people were slaves to the gods. They could only try to appease the gods. They could only try to be good enough. They were slaves. God has declared you and creation as very good. God gives that dignity to his creation. I found it interesting as I was reading about some of these ancient Eastern beliefs. I found it interesting that almost all of them, the people came out of a conflict between gods. And then, boom, people. This doesn't come out of a conflict. This comes out of a creator that wanted to create. That saw that this was good, and so I'm going to create this. Made the decision to create and lovingly create. So God brings order to chaos. He creates life, and he declares all that he's made to be good. And then he creates man and woman. And he does so for a reason that we often gloss over. This is what it says about his decision. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds," and so on and so forth. What is this saying that the defining characteristic of the image of God is? Why did he create man in his image. So that. It's an important word there. So that. So that we can rule over. We weren't created in the image of any of the animals because they aren't given the task of ruling. What we've just seen played out in front of us reveals to us who God is, and then also who He has created us to be. As image bearers, as created things, made in the likeness of our Creator. We are made to rule over the rest of creation. And I find that unbelievable. And I find that a little strange, too. That God would choose to make us partners with Him. That God would give us that type of responsibility. Many people would say that the image of God is being able to think and make decisions. I tend to agree with that if I read this story in its entirety. And I believe that this is why the arts, music, dance, painting, writing, sewing, those types of things are such a good expression of the image of God. Creativity, decision-making to make something and create something. Decisions are needed. You guys as farmers know this. Decisions are needed. God has given you the task to rule over creation, to make good decisions for the rest of creation, to think through and make decisions so that the land will produce and keep on producing. Those are examples of the image of God. And there's many other places that we could go, and we could talk about many other things that show us this image of God. Verse 28, it says this. We're still in chapter 1. You guys are thinking, man, alive. We got a lot of ground to cover yet. Don't worry, it'll go a little bit quicker in a little bit. Verse 28 says, God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over it. And then He gave everything over to the man and the woman. Fill the earth and subdue it. Isn't that just what God has done before this? He just finished filling the earth and subduing it. Subdue is to bring under control, to take chaos and order it. And so that is what the image of God is invited to take part in. Another way to say it, God blesses man. God blesses man and gives responsibility to man to bless creation. And then we get to chapter 2. And really, chapter 2 is a retelling of the story, but with man being the reference point. It builds this idea of the responsibility of man. God plants a garden, puts Adam in the garden to work it and to take care of it. And in order to be able to do that, Adam needs decision-making ability. And that's what the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil are there for. To signify choice between good ways of partnering and working and taking care and ways that will destroy. And so the first chapter is about God. It establishes God's rule and reign over creation. And the second chapter describes the authority and blessing God gave man over creation. And then chapter 3 comes, and it introduces a new character to the story. The serpent. And it's a serpent. It's not necessarily a snake. It's a serpent. The serpent signifies the other force at play in creation. God has brought order and life and blessing over His good creation, and God gives man the charge to rule over it well. There's a right way to rule, and there's a wrong way to rule. And the serpent's desire is completely opposite to God's desire. The serpent wants mankind to rule according to their own desires, not God's desire for them. In order for decisions to be made regarding the ruling of creation, God must give man choice. His desire is that they will follow Him and his commands, signified by the tree of life. He gives one command to the man. Look at all I created. It's good to look at. It's good for eating. It's good. Everything is good. But there's one thing that you must not do. Don't eat from that tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Trust me. Trust me. The serpent, his sole desire is that humans will take matters into their own hands and define for themselves what's good and what's evil. At this point, God defines what's good and what's not good, but the serpent wants them to define it for themselves. The two humans are tempted to take matters into their own hands, and they proceed to define for themselves what is good and evil. I'm not going to listen to what God said was good and evil. You know what? This is good. I want that. And they took a hold of it. And they ate of that one tree that God said not to. What is Moses trying to help the people of Israel understand? In short, Moses is teaching the people that when humans try to define on their own terms what is good and what is evil, creation becomes undone. Instead of blessing, comes curse. Instead of humans ruling over good creation, humans descend into evil acts. Instead of life and life to the full, humans experience death. And it happens in many, many different ways. Death of relationships, spiritual deadness, physical death. And instead of bringing order and continuing to bring order to creation, what is it? That's the result? Chaos. When mankind fails to trust in God and his good purposes and commands for them, what God has just done becomes undone. And really, the rest of the first 11 chapters paint a picture of the depravity of humankind. Things go from bad to worse. Cain takes his anger into his own hands, kills Abel. Lamech, we don't hear a lot about him, but he also takes matters into his own hands, and he kills someone too. And he is described as a violent man. They descend to a point of evil in which God decides to destroy them. 6 verse 5, the Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that listen to this, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. What? What? When we define what is good and evil for ourselves, humans will always descend into evil. So God sends a flood. Noah is spared. What happens after the flood? Noah gets off the ark, and what are the words God says to him? The same words he says to Adam. Be fruitful and multiply. Rule over creation. Sounds like Adam, doesn't it? Restart. And then Noah plants a garden. This sounds like a restart. He plants a vineyard, and then what happens? You remember? He gets drunk. Noah! Didn't you see what happened to these people? You're trying to define it on your own terms again, Noah. And then chapter 11, that famous story of the Tower of Babel. The people take matters into their own hands. They try to make a name for themselves. And God scatters them. What does that sound like? That sounds like chaos again. From order back to chaos. And so Moses, lets the people in on the foundational truths that God brought order to chaos. But humans, when we take things into our own hands, we undo the order, and it produces chaos. Some of the things that as you're reading through it this week, take note of the chaos that it produces. The chaos of shame. I think we all know the chaos of shame. The inner chaos that we have when we have done things our own way. You feel totally ripped up inside. And there's shame. It happened to Adam and Eve. They tried to hide from God. Why? Because they had inner chaos, inner turmoil of shame. The chaos of blame. When you blame other people, it never ends. And life can feel impossible because there's always someone else. There's chaos in creation and the chaos of pain, turmoil inside. We tend to get more violent and more corrupt when we take things into our own hands. Those things all feel chaotic. It's not God that brings about that chaos. God brought life to creation. And when humans took things into their own hands, death became the result. Death to relationships. We see that all throughout Genesis 1 to 11. Death to a direct relationship with God. And one of the items on the curse was death, physical death. Moses is telling his people, God created everything good, including his purposes and his commands. But when humans took things into their own hands and wanted to define what was good for themselves, where did they descend into? Not goodness, but evil. And when God blessed creation, humans, they used that blessing and that ruling nature that they were given to take matters into their own hands. And what came about? Curse. The very thing that multiplies human beings. Childbearing was cursed. Relationships were cursed. The ground was cursed. And ultimately, all mankind was cursed. And so, is that clear or is that clear? Genesis 1 to 11. It reflects the God that we serve in such a glorious way, doesn't it? Especially chapter 1 and 2. Boy. Picture of who God is, what his good creation was intended to be. And then it turns the mirror on us and shows us how we humans, humanity, everyone, have treated the good that God has created. And really that sets the stage for the entire rest of the story. This is the stage on which God's story is played out on the earth. God works in partnership with mankind on a project that will span thousands of years and that will ultimately end up in the new creation, which is brought about through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ and the work of the Holy Spirit in the people of God. How will God do it? How will God bring about this redemption to a stubborn people of who we are a part of? People who constantly take matters into our own hands. How will God choose to work together with people who can't seem to get it right? The stage is set. The problem has been pinpointed. How will the problem be solved? Those answers become clearer and clearer as the story of the Bible continues. In closing, Genesis 1 to 11 doesn't just reflect God and humanity to us, but it actually also has a little prediction. It's considered the earliest prophecy of the Messiah, just 3 chapters in. In the curse of the serpent, God makes a statement that points to an event to come. Moses telling the origin story already speaks to the plan of redemption that God has. Genesis 3, verse 15. This is what it says. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed, or offspring, or descendants, and hers. Now, this is not the theology of why we are so scared of snakes. It's the seed of the serpent. It is the seed of this other force that is working to get us off track. What does it say? He will crush your head. Victory. And you will strike his heel. What's that talking about? The cross. That's talking about the cross. At the very moment when evil thought they had won, because they struck his heel, what did Jesus do? He crushed Satan's head. Victory that comes from seeming defeat. Prediction of Christ. 3 chapters in. Don't tell me this book doesn't point to Jesus Christ. And so, this is the foundation story of humankind. We've covered thousands of years. I hope you haven't felt it took thousands of years. We are a little later than usual. Next week, Norman will slow things down a little bit, although I think he has way more chapters to cover, so I don't know how he's going to do that. Norman, I got thousands of years. You only got 400 years? Yeah, he'll breeze through it. And we're going to begin to look at the seed, the descendants, the family line from which Jesus Christ ultimately came. I'm looking forward to this. And so let's read our Bibles this week, and let's read more about this story that we talked about today. Amen.